The second hand kept arriving at the same place and leaving again, as if it had forgotten what it was supposed to do there. Someone had set a mug down too close to the edge of the desk. It didn't spill, not yet, but every time the building gave its small, ordinary settling sound, the liquid inside drew a thin ring against the porcelain like a warning drawn in pencil. A pencil lay beside it, unsharpened, turning slowly under a fingertip that didn't realize it was moving. There was a radiator somewhere that never quite warmed up. It clicked and clicked again, impatient with itself. A wire vibrated faintly in the ceiling, the way a violin string vibrates when another note is played in the room next door. No one spoke loud enough to claim the space. Even the boots were careful. Leather soles found the same boards in the same order, as if the floor had become a map, and the map had to be followed exactly. Paper was being handled in the corner with the solemnity of prayer. A page lifted, hovered, and laid down again. Another page. The same sequence, repeated. It sounded like dry leaves. Somewhere behind a thin wall, a typewriter cleared its throat and gave up after 2 keys, leaving the room with an unfinished thought. A man in a chair leaned forward, not to stand, just to be closer to whatever might arrive. His knee bounced twice, stopped, then began again, as if remembering its duty. He looked at a clock he didn't trust, and then at another clock he didn't trust either, and his eyes moved between them with the slow, resigned patience of someone watching two strangers argue in silence. The air carried the faint smell of metal and old wool. Not fresh smoke, not fire, just the tired scent of objects that had been used too long and too often. Someone had recently opened a window, and now the cold pressed in at the edges, testing every crack, slipping along the floor in thin, invisible streams. It touched ankles first, then climbed. A hand reached for a telephone and stopped short of it, hovering above the receiver like it might burn. The hand withdrew. It returned a minute later. It withdrew again. The phone stayed perfectly still, like an animal pretending to sleep. In the quiet between sounds, you could hear the faint electrical hum inside it, a small, steady breath. On a shelf, a stack of folders leaned slightly left, as if fatigued. A binder clip glinted each time someone shifted in their seat. The glint was sharp, momentary, like the flash of a distant mirror. Every light in the room seemed too weak for what it was being asked to illuminate. Someone coughed in a restrained way, as if even that was too much disruption. Another person cleared his throat, and then kept his mouth closed, swallowing the words he'd been about to form. A chair creaked, apologized, and went still. The ordinary noises were louder than they should have been, as if the room had grown sensitive, as if it was listening for something and mistaking everything else for it. A message pad sat open with a blank line waiting to be filled. The pen beside it had a smeared thumbprint on the barrel. The thumbprint looked like a bruise. Outside, far enough away to be dismissed, close enough to be felt, there was the low, continuous sound of engines idling, not rushing, not leaving, just holding, a kind of mechanical patience. The sound didn't rise or fall. It simply remained, a steady pressure against the wall. A door at the end of the corridor opened once, then closed again without anyone entering. It was the smallest interruption, barely worth noticing, except every head turned and eyes lifted, hands paused, breath delayed. Then the room returned to its careful motions, as if pretending that reflex hadn't happened. Someone checked a watch and adjusted it by a minute, then checked it again as if the minute had resisted. A strip of sunlight, pale and reluctant, moved across the table so slowly it seemed imaginary. Dust floated through it in tiny, patient spirals. The waiting wasn't empty. It was crowded with unasked questions and completed routines. It pressed down on shoulders and sat in throats. It made every small action feel rehearsed. It made even blinking feel like a choice. And in the center of it all, the clocks continued, insistent, indifferent, measuring out the last of something no one had named yet. Somewhere nearby, a bell was supposed to ring. It didn't, not yet. But the space before it was getting shorter. A name was spoken softly for the first time, not announced, not introduced, just used the way you use a name when you assume everyone already knows. Bring it to Haller. The runner hesitated at the doorway, as if the air in the room were thicker than outside. He held a thin folder against his chest with both hands, like something fragile and embarrassing. His cheeks were pink from cold, or from the distance he'd covered, or from the small shame of interrupting. The folder had a faint damp mark at the corner where his glove had melted snow into paper. Haller didn't look up right away. He had a pencil between two fingers and was tapping it once, twice, 3 times against the edge of a map that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had become permanent scars. The map lay open across a long table under a lamp whose shade had been dented on one side, tilting the light so that one portion was bright and the rest fell into a patient gloom. On the map, a river curved like a vein. A road ran parallel to it, then broke away into smaller lines that vanished into the white of the paper, the way roads vanished into snow outside. Someone had drawn circles in blue pencil around certain points, then crossed out 2 of them. then drawn them again with a darker hand as if trying to make them more real. The room was not large, but it was full of objects that had decided where they belonged. Coats on hooks, helmets under chairs, a kettle on a small stove in the corner that never boiled so much as threatened, a wire rack for messages, a calendar with the days crossed through in thick strokes. The smell of damp wool and ink and cigarette ends pressed into tin trays. It was the kind of room where time didn't pass. It accumulated. Outside the windows, gray light sat on everything without mercy. The glass had a thin lattice of frost. Each time a gust moved through the yard outside, the frost trembled like hair. "Set it down," Haller said, still looking at the map. The runner placed the folder on the table near the lamp, but not directly under it, as if he didn't want the light to expose what was inside. He stepped back. He remained standing. Nobody told him to leave, and he didn't dare assume he could. A man near the wall, older, with a collar that didn't fit right, was stirring a mug with the same slow motion, over and over, as if the spoon could keep the world in order if it kept moving. The tea inside had gone dark and cold, but he continued anyway. On his sleeve, there was a stain the color of dried rust. The typewriter in the adjacent room began again, clacking for a few seconds, then stopping with a hard, final strike that sounded like a door slamming. Someone murmured a number. Someone else repeated it, but softer, like repeating a prayer you didn't believe in. Haller finally opened the folder. The paper inside was thin and slightly translucent, the kind that felt too delicate for what it carried. He held it up to the lamp with one hand, and the light turned his fingers into pale bones. His eyes moved across the lines slowly, not because it was hard to read, but because reading was a kind of delay. When he reached the bottom, he didn't react. He simply set the sheet down and looked at the map again, as if the message had been written there all along and he'd merely confirmed it. "What time?" he asked. A man seated on the far end of the table, his hair neatly parted, his face clean-shaven in a way that looked deliberate, checked his watch and answered without inflection. He didn't say approximately. He didn't say maybe. He gave a time as if time itself had sworn an oath. 1540. No one responded to that, because it wasn't a question that needed discussion. It was a fact that could be carried, like a box, from one room to another. Someone moved a chair closer to the table. The scrape of the legs on the floor sounded too loud. A few heads turned sharply, then relaxed when they realized it was only furniture. The room had become jumpy without admitting it. At the edge of the table, another officer traced a line on the map with the blunt end of his pencil. He stopped at a bridge drawn in black ink and held his pencil there as if the line might move if he let go. His fingernails were bitten down to the quick. The skin around them looked sore. "They'll hold," he said, not to anyone in particular. It sounded like something he'd been saying for days. A quieter voice replied, almost kindly, "They always do." The kindness didn't make it true. It simply made it easier to swallow. The routine continued around that table like a well-rehearsed play. Messages arrived. They were stamped. They were copied. They were placed into racks. A man with ink-stained fingers blew gently on a page to dry it, then blew again and again, as if the drying mattered more than the content. In the yard outside, vehicles sat in rows, engines idling. The sound came through the walls as a faint vibration that never stopped. Men moved between them with hunched shoulders, hands tucked into armpits for warmth. They checked straps. They tightened laces. They performed the small rituals of readiness the way a person straightens his tie before bad news. A soldier passed beneath the window carrying a coil of wire. He stopped halfway across the yard to adjust it on his shoulder, then continued. The coil looked like a sleeping snake. It left a faint trail in the snow where it brushed, a thin line that would vanish once the wind decided to erase it. Inside, someone laughed briefly at something that wasn't funny. The laugh came out sharp, then died quickly, like a match flaring and going black. Two men exchanged a glance and returned to their papers. The laugh had been a crack in the surface. Nobody wanted to look into it. At the stove, the kettle began to rattle, then quieted again. It never committed to boiling. It was always nearly there, always almost. Someone watched it with mild irritation, then looked away, as if even water had become unreliable. A telephone rang in the corridor. One ring, then silence. It wasn't answered here. It was answered elsewhere. The sound still made several spines straighten. For a second, the room held its breath, then released it in tiny increments. "Any confirmation?" Haller asked, still staring at the map. A man standing behind him, tall, with shoulders that looked tired rather than strong, shook his head. "Not yet." The word "yet" hung in the air as if it had weight. It should have produced urgency. It should have changed the rhythm. But the rhythm refused to change, as if the routine itself were an act of defiance against reality. Men continued to speak in measured tones. They continued to refer to schedules. They continued to use words like "by evening" and "before dawn," as if those were dependable borders. At one point, someone mentioned the weather with the casualness of a farmer. "Cloud covers holding." "That's good," someone answered. "That's good." They said it the way you say, "that's good," when you don't know what else to say. when you need at least one thing to sound stable. A clerk entered with a stack of forms and waited until he found a gap in the room's attention. He placed the forms down, received a nod, and left without speaking. His boots left wet prints that began to darken the wood floor. The prints were like a countdown that evaporated slowly. On the wall, a large clock ticked with visible effort. The second hand jerked forward in small, stubborn steps. Its movement was not smooth. It was forced, like a man dragging a heavy object across a room. 1540 became 1541. No one announced it. No one needed to. Everybody in the room felt the change in the way a person feels the shift of a train leaving a station, not by looking, but by the subtle rearrangement of balance. Haller picked up the paper again. He read it one more time. Even though the words wouldn't be different, he folded it carefully, then unfolded it, then smoothed it flat with the palm of his hand, as if he could press the future into a better shape. Someone spoke from near the window, trying to sound casual. If it doesn't come in by 1600, we'll still have time. The word still was another lie nobody challenged. A pencil snapped at the table's edge. The sound was small, like a twig breaking underfoot, but it made several people flinch. The man who had snapped it stared at the broken ends in his hand, as if he didn't recognize his own strength. He set the pieces down and reached for another pencil without looking for permission. Outside, the engines continued their low, patient hum. Inside, the maps remained open, and the clocks kept moving, each tick quietly taking something away. 1600 was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. A loose sheet of paper slid halfway off the table and hung there, undecided, its corner fluttering each time someone passed too close. No one noticed it, or they noticed, and chose not to see it. Eventually, a hand nudged it back into place without breaking conversation, like returning a glass to the edge of a shelf before it fell. The radio crackled once, sharply, then settled into a low hiss that filled the room like breath through clenched teeth. A technician leaned toward it, adjusted a dial by a fraction, then leaned back again. The hiss remained. It was the sound of distance, of something trying to cross space and failing politely. Probably interference, he said, already turning away. No one asked what kind. A courier arrived with snow still clinging to the hem of his coat. He stamped his feet at the door, apologetic, then removed his cap and held it against his chest while he waited to be acknowledged. His eyes moved from face to face, searching for instruction. He carried a narrow envelope sealed with wax that had cracked in the cold, a thin red line running through it like a fault in stone. Haller accepted it without ceremony. He broke the seal with his thumb and slid the paper out, careful not to tear it. He read the first line. His brow tightened, just slightly, then smoothed again. He read the rest. When he finished, he folded the paper twice and slipped it back into the... "Anything?" someone asked, too quickly. "Nothing new," Haller said. It was true in the most dangerous way. The words on the paper had not introduced anything new. They had only confirmed what had already been drifting at the edge of everyone's thoughts. The way a smell warns you of something long before you see smoke. At the far end of the room, a junior officer was arguing quietly with a sergeant over a set of numbers written in the margin of a chart. Their voices were low, controlled. The argument contained entirely in tone and timing rather than volume. "These don't line up," the junior officer said, tapping the page. "They never do," the sergeant replied. "You average them." "I did average, then average them again." The junior officer hesitated, then erased a figure and wrote another. The act of rewriting seemed to satisfy both of them. They moved on. A telephone rang again, this time twice. It was answered in the corridor, the voice on the other end muffled by walls and distance. Those inside could hear only fragments. A number spoken, a pause, the word, "repeat," another pause, then the sound of the receiver being set down too carefully. When the man returned, he didn't announce anything. He went back to his seat, picked up his pen, and continued writing exactly where he'd left off. Someone near the stove noticed that the kettle had finally begun to steam in earnest. He stood, poured water into 2 mugs, and carried them to the table. The mugs were chipped, mismatched. One bore a faded insignia from another time, another unit. He set them down in front of men who hadn't asked for them. They nodded their thanks anyway. The steam rose briefly, then vanished into the colder air above. At the windows, visibility shifted. The cloud cover thickened, then thinned, then thickened again, the light outside changing texture without ever changing color. A lookout outside raised binoculars, lowered them, raised them again. He adjusted the strap on his helmet and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Inside, a map marker was moved a few centimeters to the left. The man who moved it paused, reconsidered, then left it where it was. The adjustment was small enough to be explained away later, if needed, or forgotten entirely. "There's a delay," someone said, reading from a note. He didn't specify what kind. "How long?" another voice asked. "Unclear." That word passed through the room without resistance. Unclear meant manageable. Unclear meant there was still time to wait for clarity, instead of acting without it. A clerk entered and announced that a line was down. He said it calmly, as if reporting a broken window or a missing chair. The response was immediate, but subdued. Reroute. We already have. Then wait. Waiting was the one instruction everyone understood. A clock on the wall chimed softly for the half-hour. The sound was almost polite. It reminded no one of churches or homes, only of structure. It was a sound meant to reassure, and it nearly succeeded. The radio hiss sharpened again, this time joined by a faint voice beneath the static. Words emerged and vanished before they could be assembled. The technician leaned in once more. "Say again," he said into the microphone. Even though no one could hear him on the other end yet, the voice did not return. He adjusted the dial back to where it had been before, as if returning things to their proper order might also return the message. Near the door, the runner from earlier still waited. No one had dismissed him. He had shifted his weight so many times that the snow beneath his boots had melted into a small puddle. It crept outward, darkening the floor in an irregular shape. He watched it as if it were a living thing. "You can go," someone finally told him. He nodded, replaced his cap, and left quickly, relieved to be released from the room's gravity. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. A hand hovered again over the telephone receiver, this time closer than before. The fingers touched the cool surface, rested there, then withdrew. The receiver remained where it was. A man by the map spoke with forced confidence. "If they were going to move early, we'd know by now." Several heads nodded. The sentence was constructed to invite agreement. It offered a logic that could be leaned on, even if it was thin. "Yes," someone said. "Yes, that's right." Outside, a gust of wind pushed snow against the building in a low, whispering rush. It slid down the walls and gathered in corners. The engines in the yard idled on, their sound slightly uneven now, as if one of them were struggling to keep pace with the others. A report arrived handwritten, its ink smudged by moisture. It was passed from hand to hand, read silently, then set aside. No one read it aloud. No one asked questions about it. "What does it say?" someone murmured. "Same as before," came the reply. The phrase settled over the room like dust. Same as before meant acceptable. Same as before meant there was no reason to break rhythm. Time stretched in a way that made minutes feel indistinguishable from each other. Watches were checked, adjusted, checked again. A man removed his gloves, then put them back on. Another loosened his collar, then fastened it again. The clocks marked the passage with stubborn consistency, each tick a reminder that something was advancing even if nothing appeared to be happening. At 16:23, someone noticed that a scheduled transmission had not arrived. "It's probably late," he said before anyone could respond. No one contradicted him. At 16:24, the radio hiss deepened into something almost like silence. At 16:25, a light above the map flickered once and steadied. The signs were there, scattered and small, each one easy to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that no one named, because naming it would require deciding what to do about it. And deciding meant interrupting the waiting. So the room continued to wait, and whatever was approaching continued to do the same, unseen, unheard, and unchallenged. The room felt smaller without anyone having moved closer together. Chairs seemed nearer. Voices carried less distance. Even the ceiling appeared lower, the light pressing downward instead of spreading out. The sense of space had tightened, quietly, like a belt pulled one notch further without comment. A clock was checked again. No one said the time out loud, but several mouths moved as if forming the number. The hands had crossed another mark. They would keep doing that, no matter what anyone decided. A man at the table cleared his throat and began to speak, then stopped. He rearranged the papers in front of him instead, aligning their edges with unnecessary care. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, practiced. "If there's going to be an adjustment," he said, "it needs to be soon." The word adjustment floated briefly, vague enough to be harmless. It could mean anything. It could mean nothing. Haller didn't respond immediately. He was watching the map again, his gaze fixed on a section that had been studied so often it should have worn thin. His finger rested just above the paper, not touching it, tracing a route in the air. "Soon is relative," he said at last. No one argued. Relativity was another refuge. It allowed the moment to stretch without forcing a decision into it. A telephone rang somewhere deeper in the building. Not here. Somewhere else. The sound traveled through walls and corridors, muffled and distant, but it was enough to pull attention toward it. Several heads turned instinctively, then returned forward when the ring stopped. The radio remained quiet now, the hiss reduced to a faint whisper that was almost nothing at all. Silence had replaced interference, and it was somehow worse. The technician watched the needles on the panel with narrowed eyes, waiting for any sign of movement. They did not move. Outside, footsteps passed beneath the windows in a measured rhythm. Orders were being repeated quietly in the yard, voices low, careful not to carry. Equipment was being checked again. Straps tightened, loosened, tightened once more. The rituals had begun to repeat themselves, not because they were necessary, but because there was nothing else to do. A junior officer leaned closer to the table and pointed at a notation written in pencil. "If that time is accurate," he said, "then we're already past the window." No one acknowledged the word window. It suggested something closing. "That time came from a secondary source," someone replied quickly. "We're waiting on confirmation." Waiting again. The words slid easily in place, familiar and comforting. Haller straightened, just slightly, and looked around the table. His eyes moved from face to face, measuring not rank, but readiness. No one avoided his gaze. No one met it with urgency either. The room was balanced on restraint. There's no directive. Not yet carried the same fragile hope it always. It implied that the directive would arrive with enough time attached to it, that it would still matter when it came. A hand rose halfway, then fell back to the table. The man who had lifted it pressed his palm flat against the wood, grounding himself. The grain felt rough under his skin. At the window, the light shifted again. A brief thinning of cloud revealed a pale, colorless brightness before the gray returned. It was like a door opening and closing too quickly to step through. A runner appeared in the doorway, breathless, his coat unbuttoned. He held nothing in his hands. "There's a call coming through," he said. "They're trying to get it stable." "From where?" someone asked. The runner hesitated. "Forward relay." That was enough to quiet the forward meant closer than anyone liked. "How long?" Haller asked. They said, "Minutes." Minutes were suddenly smaller than they had been before. The room felt them compress, pressing against the edges of thought. "Get ready," someone said, then immediately added, "Just in case." Just in case was another soft phrase, designed to avoid the weight of commitment. The telephone on the desk began to ring. This time, it didn't stop after one or two rings. It continued, insistent, but not frantic, filling the room with its sound. No one moved to answer it right away. The ringing seemed to demand a certain readiness, as if picking it up too soon might be a mistake. Finally, Haller reached for it. He lifted the receiver and listened without speaking. The room leaned toward him, bodies tilting almost imperceptibly, as if gravity had shifted. His expression did not change. His eyes remained on the map. "Yes," he said after another pause. "Yes." The pauses stretched. Each one felt longer than the last. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed, then another. Outside, an engine revved briefly, then settled back into its uneven idle. Haller lowered the receiver slowly, deliberately, and placed it back in its cradle. He did not announce what he had heard. "Well?" someone asked. He shook his head once. Still, nothing final. Nothing final. The phrase landed heavily. Finality had been deferred, but not dismissed. A clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. The sound seemed amplified now, each second stepping forward with visible effort. A man near the back of the room exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like a decision he hadn't wanted to make. He adjusted his jacket and stood, then hesitated, then sat back down again. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The engines continued. The room had narrowed to this thin strip of time, this last uncertain stretch where movement was possible but direction was unclear. The window was still open, barely. No one named it. No one crossed it. And with each passing second, the space to act became smaller, quieter, and harder to see. Something changed without announcing itself. It was not marked on any clock. No light flickered. No voice rose to acknowledge it. The room continued exactly as it had been a moment before, which was the only reason the change mattered at all. A clerk entered carrying a ledger and stopped short when he sensed the atmosphere, the way a person senses a temperature shift upon opening a door. He hesitated, then crossed the room and set the ledger down anyway, completing the motion he had begun. The pages inside fluttered once, then lay still. The clerk remained standing, unsure whether to leave. No one noticed. At the table, a pen scratched across paper and then stopped. The man holding it stared at the last word he had written. He did not cross it out. He did not continue. He set the pen down carefully, parallel to the edge of the page, as if alignment were suddenly important. Outside, one of the engines shut off. The sound did not stop abruptly. It wound down slowly, unevenly, coughing once before falling silent. The absence it left behind was sharper than the noise had been. For the first time in hours, there was a gap in the steady mechanical hum, a hollow where sound had. Several heads lifted at once. "Which one was that?" someone asked. No one answered. Not because they didn't know, but because knowing would require acknowledging what it meant. A man at the window leaned forward and pressed his forehead lightly against the cold glass, leaving a brief fog that vanished almost immediately. He squinted into the gray beyond, searching for motion, for confirmation of something he couldn't yet name. Inside, a message slip was removed from the wire rack and placed on the table. It was small, almost insignificant, written in a cramped hand. Haller glanced at it, then slid it beneath the map without comment, where it disappeared entirely. A chair scraped as someone stood. He adjusted his belt, then his collar, then his belt again, caught in a loop of preparation with nowhere to direct it. The radio gave a brief burst of static, sharp and sudden, then fell silent again. This time the technician did not reach for the dials. He stared at the panel instead, his hands resting uselessly at his sides. "That's not right," he said, more to himself than to anyone. "Probably temporary," came the automatic reply. The word probably felt thinner now. It didn't carry as far. A courier passed the window at a quick walk, then returned at a run. Snow kicked up around his boots. He slowed when he reached the door, composed himself, and entered at a controlled pace. Breath shallow, eyes alert. "They're moving," he said. No direction was specified. None was. "Who?" someone asked. "Already know." The courier swallowed. "Units along the line." A pause followed. Not long. Just long enough for the room to register that something had been said, which could not be taken back. "Orders?" Haller asked. The courier shook his head. "Not new ones. Not new ones." The phrase landed like a weight. Movement without instruction. Momentum without command. Outside, another engine shut down, then another. The remaining ones adjusted, their rhythm changing subtly as the balance shifted. Boots moved faster now. Voices carried sharper edges, still low, but more urgent. Metal clinked against metal in a way that suggested haste rather than routine. Inside, a map marker was nudged again, this time more decisively. It slid into a position it had never occupied. The man who moved it didn't look around for approval. He simply did it, then withdrew his hand. "That's premature," someone murmured. "No," another voice replied quietly. "That's accurate." Accuracy had arrived late. The telephone rang again. One ring, then silence. It was not answered. It did not ring a second time. Haller straightened fully now. The motion was subtle, but it shifted the room's center of gravity. He placed both hands on the table, palms flat, grounding himself in the physical fact of it. "We maintain position," he said. The words were familiar. They had been used countless times. They had always implied control. This time, they sounded like a description rather than an instruction. Outside, a whistle blew, short, sharp. It was answered by another farther away. The sounds overlapped briefly, then stopped. Snow was disturbed in patterns that would not be smoothed out easily. A junior officer stepped closer to the table. "If they're already moving?" Haller raised a hand, not sharply, just enough. The sentence ended unfinished, hanging uselessly in the air. "We wait," Haller said again. The room obeyed. It always did. But waiting had changed its nature. It was no longer a choice. It was a consequence. Another report arrived, this one verbal, delivered at the doorway in a low, urgent voice. It was not repeated aloud. Haller nodded once, absorbing it without comment. Somewhere beyond the walls, a door closed and did not reopen. The clocks continued to tick, but they seemed to do so from farther away now, as if receding. Time was still moving, but the room was no longer traveling. It had been left behind, anchored to a decision that had already been overtaken. No announcement was made. No order was rescinded. Nothing dramatic occurred. And yet, with the quiet shutdown of engines, with movement begun elsewhere, with signals fading and markers shifting, the last invisible line had been crossed. Not by intent, not by command, simply by continuing. The room did not empty. No one rushed out. No one froze in place either. It held, suspended in a strange stillness that felt deliberate only because it had no other shape left to take. A man reached for his coat and stopped with his arm halfway through the sleeve, as if remembering something he had forgotten to do first. He stood like that for several seconds, then slowly finished the motion. The coat settled on his shoulders with a soft sound that seemed too loud in the quiet. The radio remained silent, not hissing, not crackling, just silent. The technician sat back in his chair and folded his hands together, resting them on his knees. He stared straight ahead, no longer waiting for the needles to move. Outside, the remaining engines shut down one by one. Each silence arrived gently, but the pattern was unmistakable. The yard emptied of sound until only the wind remained, moving snow across metal and concrete in thin, restless lines. Inside, the clock ticked. The second hand advanced. It did not hesitate. It did not care that its sound now carried farther than it should. Each movement felt exposed. A message slip lay unread on the table, its corner curling upward as if trying to escape the surface beneath it. No one reached for it. No one pretended not to see it. It simply existed, irrelevant now. Someone sat down heavily, the chair legs scraping before settling. The sound echoed faintly, then vanished. Another man stood and walked toward the window, stopping just short of it. He did not look outside. He stared at the glass itself, at his own faint reflection layered over the gray beyond. Haller remained at the table. He had not moved since placing his hands there. His eyes were no longer on the map. They were unfocused, directed toward a point slightly above it, as if looking through paper, through wood, through walls. A breath moved through the room, not synchronized, not collective, but shared. Shoulders rose, Shoulders fell. The tension did not release. It redistributed. Somewhere far away, something heavy shifted. The sound arrived late and indistinct, carried through layers of distance and wind. It could have been anything. It could have been nothing. No one commented. The clock marked another minute. A man glanced at his watch and then turned it face down on his wrist, as if the numbers had lost their usefulness. Another removed his cap and held it in both hands, fingers worrying the brim without realizing. The door at the end of the corridor stood closed. No footsteps approached it. No voice called through it. The building itself seemed to listen. The radio stayed silent. The telephones did not ring. The map lay open, unchanged now, its lines suddenly final. Outside, the wind eased. Snow settled. The yard became very still. Inside, nothing moved except time. The pause stretched thin, tight enough to tear, and just before it did, everything stopped.